By the winter of 1943, the war had shifted decisively against Germany, though few inside the Reich dared to speak the truth aloud. Snow crusted the edges of Berlin's shattered streets, muffling the distant sound of anti-aircraft batteries as they fired blindly into black skies. Trains carrying wounded men from the Eastern Front shuddered through the capital like funeral processions, their cargo a reminder of how far the German war machine had fallen from its early triumphs. And yet, in the upper echelons of the Nazi state, one belief still held firm. Adolf Hitler, the man who had dragged Europe into disaster, could not be touched. His survival, after bombings, air raids, and the collapse of entire armies, had become something close to doctrine. It seeped into the speeches of propagandists, into the whispers inside the officer corps, even into the quiet conversations of civilians waiting out the war by candlelight. Hitler lived, the myth went, because destiny willed it so. The truth was far less mystical. The security surrounding him had grown into a suffocating labyrinth of SS guards, checkpoints, and unpredictable schedules. His travel routes changed without warning. Meetings were moved, postponed, or dissolved entirely at a moment's notice. Sometimes he retreated deep into the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, surrounded by bunkers and barbed wire. Other times, he vanished into the mountain air of Berchtesgaden, where the sunlight draped over the Bavarian Alps like a curtain hiding the world below. To his followers, this was evidence of genius. To many inside the military, a growing number by 1943, it was proof of paranoia. Still, the effect was the same. Hitler seemed untouchable. But beneath that carefully crafted facade lay a secret history, one that even many generals never fully understood. Over the previous decade, a quiet war had been waged within Germany itself, one fought not across continents, but within the shadows of briefing rooms, forest paths, and rail depots. It was a war carried out by Germans who believed that the only way to save their country was to stop the man leading it toward ruin. And again, in ways large and small, they tried to kill him. The earliest attempts came long before the Wehrmacht marched onto foreign soil. In 1934 and 1935, a handful of disillusioned officers sketched crude plans that never advanced beyond whispered discussions. As the regime tightened its grip, the plots grew more daring. In 1938, as Europe teetered on the edge of crisis during the Sudetenland negotiations, a group within the Abwehr positioned a sniper along a wooded slope above the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine residence. The man lay still for hours, his rifle barrel steady despite the cold. But Hitler, altering his itinerary at the last moment, never appeared on the path. He slipped through our fingers, one conspirator later wrote, as if he moved on a different clock than the rest of us. By 1939, as Germany prepared to ignite the war in Poland, the stakes rose sharply. Georg Elser, a quiet carpenter from Württemberg, built a bomb with painstaking precision and planted it inside Munich's Bürgerbräukeller, where Hitler delivered his annual speech commemorating the failed 1923 beer hall putsch. Elser's timing device worked exactly as intended. The explosion tore through brick and timber with devastating force, but Hitler, who had left the hall 13 minutes early to catch a train, survived. Photographs taken afterwards showed debris scattered like kindling across the floor, beams splintered as though crushed by a giant's hand. To the SS, this was a sign that vigilance had prevailed. To others, the coincidence felt uncanny, almost mocking. By the middle of the war, these coincidences accumulated into a narrative that Joseph Goebbels embraced with enthusiasm. In speeches broadcast across the Reich, he wove Hitler's survival into a story of providence. The Führer, he insisted, is shielded by fate itself. The phrase took hold, repeated in barracks, in cafes, in letters from the front. But inside the intelligence offices of Berlin, where officers like Hans Oster and Hans von Dohnanyi quietly compiled evidence of Nazi crimes, the phrase took on a darker meaning. Fate was not a shield, it was an obstacle, and every missed opportunity tightened the noose around Germany's future. By 1943, after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad and the loss of North Africa, the urgency transformed into something close to desperation. "We are losing the war," one senior officer wrote in a private note, "and we have only one means left to save the country from absolute destruction." The conspirators, many of whom had once believed in Hitler's leadership, now faced a darker realization. The Reich's survival required his death. They prepared new plans, more precise, more daring, more dangerous. They studied his routines, tracked his meetings, timed his speeches. They watched the ebb and flow of his moods, hoping for a moment when his guard might slip. Yet the deeper truth, the one hidden from both the German public and much of the Allied world, was that these plots were not isolated incidents. They formed a continuous thread stretching from the 1930s to the final year of the war. More than 40 attempts, each shaped by a mixture of courage, fear, and moral reckoning. Some were bold enough to leave scars on the historical record. Others existed only in fragments of diaries or interrogations preserved after the collapse of the Reich. Together, they revealed a tension pulsing at the heart of Hitler's Germany, a struggle between obedience and conscience, between the machinery of dictatorship and the quiet persistence of human doubt. As 1943 drew to a close, one belief began to crumble among those who still dared to resist. Hitler was not invincible. He was simply a man whose survival owed more to chance, circumstance, and his own mistrust of the world than to any divine protection. And in the winter darkness of East Prussia, deep inside his fortified headquarters, a new plot began to take shape, one that would bring the Shadow War closer to success than ever before. By the spring of 1944, the war had settled into a grinding, relentless rhythm, the kind that wears down nations as surely as it exhausts men. Along the Eastern Front, entire German divisions retreated under the weight of Soviet artillery that seemed to pulse like a rolling tide. In Italy, Allied bombers carved new scars into the Apennines with each passing week. And in Berlin, where the lights dimmed earlier now and the food lines stretched longer, the myth of Hitler's untouchability still clung to the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. But beneath that aura, behind the sealed doors of ministries and intelligence offices, the war within the war intensified. The conspirators had come to understand something vital. Hitler's survival was no longer just a moral burden. It was a strategic catastrophe. The men who now shouldered this responsibility were not revolutionaries by temperament. They were officers, jurists, and officials who had spent their lives in institutions built long before Hitler seized power. They knew discipline. They knew the cost of insubordination. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, how ruthlessly the regime crushed dissent. Yet, by 1944, many concluded that history had backed them into a corner where loyalty itself became treason. If they remained silent, the war would grind Germany into dust. If they acted, they risked their families, their careers, and their lives. One of them wrote in a private memorandum later recovered after the war, "We were raised to follow orders. We were not raised to watch our nation burn." It was in this climate that plots multiplied like brush fires. Some were born from the long corridors of the Abwehr, where Admiral Wilhelm Canaris maintained an outward facade of loyalty, even as he quietly encouraged resistance behind the scenes. Others emerged from small circles of officers stationed on the Eastern Front, men hardened by months of retreat, who had seen the ruins of Kharkov, the bodies left behind at the Dnieper, the terrible arithmetic of a war that had turned decisively against them. One lieutenant, writing home after the collapse of Army Group South, described the mood bluntly. "If only someone in Berlin would act. We fight and die and wait for a miracle that never arrives." But miracles were in short supply, and the conspirators knew they could no longer rely on chance. As the spring thaw melted the snow in East Prussia, a new idea emerged. Instead of waiting for the perfect moment, they would create it. Hitler's schedule, erratic though it was, still required him to meet regularly with senior officers to review the war's progress. These briefings, tense, crowded, and suffocating, offered one of the few predictable opportunities to strike. If a bomb could be placed close enough, in a confined room, surrounded by heavy timber, the explosion might accomplish what snipers and timing devices had failed to achieve. Yet even as this plan took shape, smaller plots flickered at the margins. British intelligence, working through the Special Operations Executive, had once attempted to smuggle an explosive disguised as a bottle of French cognac onto the aircraft used for Hitler's travel. The device, beautifully engineered, failed only because the freezing temperatures inside the luggage compartment rendered the detonator inert. Another attempt in that same restless period involved a lone conspirator embedded among the SS guards, a man willing to strap explosives around his torso and walk within arm's reach of Hitler during a scheduled inspection. His courage was real, but the opportunity never came. At the last moment, the inspection was cancelled, a decision likely made on little more than a whim, yet one that preserved Hitler's life. These failures weighed heavily on the conspirators. They were not merely tactical setbacks. They carried a moral toll. Each missed chance meant more soldiers dying on the Eastern Front, more civilians crushed beneath falling masonry in Hamburg, Cologne, or Kassel. And yet the men involved understood something that historians would later underscore. Assassination is a discipline of inches, seconds, and unrepeatable circumstances. A delay on a train platform, a shift in wind direction, a misplaced briefcase, any of these could unravel months of planning. In the Shadow War, precision was demanded, but luck remained the final arbiter. By May 1944, the circle of resistance tightened around one central figure, a wounded veteran named Klaus von Stauffenberg. His injuries, sustained in North Africa when a British fighter-bomber tore through his convoy, had cost him an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers on his remaining one. But they had sharpened his resolve. He returned to Germany, convinced that the war had become a crime and that he had a duty to end it. To those who met him, he carried a calm intensity, a certainty that the time for hesitation had passed. "We must dare," he told a colleague. "Even if we fail, we must dare." In the dim offices of the Bendler block in Berlin, maps of Europe lay spread across tables like wounded bodies. Red pins pushed deep into the lines around Minsk, Rome, and the Caen sector spoke of a Reich collapsing on all fronts. This atmosphere, part fatalism, part urgency, became the crucible in which the July plot was forged. And as Stauffenberg studied the layout of Hitler's briefing room at the Wolfschanze, the conspirators understood that their years of failed attempts had converged on a single moment, one last effort to break the myth that had smothered Germany for so long. Outside, the war thundered toward its summer climax. Inside, another battle, secret, silent, and perilous, neared its decisive hour. By July 1944, the war had narrowed to a single question, haunting every command post from Normandy to the Vistula. How long could Germany continue to fight a war it had already lost? The Allied landings in France had opened a second front that pressed relentlessly inland. In the east, Operation Bagration shattered entire German armies in a matter of weeks. Across the map, the once expansive lines of the Reich curled inward like paper singed at the edges. Yet, at the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters deep in the forests of East Prussia, there remained an eerie sense of detachment from the chaos beyond the wire. The pine trees absorbed the sound of distant thunder. The bunkers, reinforced with timber and concrete, held the smell of damp earth year-round. It was here, amid the quiet and the ever-present tension, that the most daring attempt on Hitler's life moved toward its irrevocable hour. Klaus von Stauffenberg arrived that morning under a sharp, slate-colored sky. The flight from Berlin had been rough, the summer heat rising in shimmering waves over the East Prussian lakes. He carried with him a briefcase identical to dozens that passed through SS checkpoints every day, its leather worn but polished. Inside, wrapped carefully beneath folders and reports, lay a block of British plastic explosive fitted with a timed detonator. The device was small, no larger than a book, yet powerful enough, if placed close enough, to tear open the room where Hitler met with his generals. Stauffenberg had rehearsed the sequence countless times. The placement of the fuse, the snap of the primer, the subtle pressure needed from a hand that no longer possessed full strength. Every detail mattered. Every second mattered more. The briefing that day was to be held not in the concrete bunker where Hitler usually met his advisors, but in a wooden hut, reinforced only lightly against the summer heat. This change, whether logistical or impulsive, created an advantage the conspirators had scarcely dared hope for. Timber walls would not absorb shock the way concrete would. Windows, though shuttered, could vent the blast outward. The room itself, crowded, warm, and claustrophobic, was an ideal trap. As Stauffenberg stepped inside, he noted the heavy oak table at the center, its legs thick enough to anchor a small bridge. Men leaned over maps strewn across its surface, their voices low, their expressions worn. The air smelled of sweat, pine resin, and tobacco, a scent familiar to war rooms across Europe. In accounts later pieced together, Stauffenberg remained composed, his movements deliberate. He requested a moment to update his papers, stepping behind a partition to arm the bomb. Working with only 3 fingers required patience, and each second ticked past with the weight of inevitability. He crushed the capsule that activated the fuse, heard the faint hiss, and knew the device was now counting down. Sliding it into the briefcase, he returned to the conference table and placed it near Hitler, close enough that no layer of wood should have protected him. Then, citing a phone call he needed to take, Stauffenberg excused himself and walked away, careful not to quicken his pace. What happened next has been reconstructed from scattered testimonies, guards, stenographers, officers who survived the blast. After Stauffenberg left the room, an adjutant, irritated by the cramped conditions, nudged the briefcase aside, shifting it behind one of the table's massive legs. This single gesture, small, instinctive, unnoticed, altered the course of the war. The thick oak served as a shield, absorbing most of the force that should have torn through Hitler's torso. When the bomb detonated, the room erupted in a violent burst of flame and splintered timber. Smoke filled the hut, blotting out the light, sending men stumbling into walls as the shock wave punched outward. Stauffenberg, already outside the complex, saw the plume rise above the tree line. To him, it was proof enough. He boarded his vehicle, convinced that Hitler was finally dead, and raced toward the airfield. Back in Berlin, the conspirators initiated Operation Valkyrie, their plan to seize control of the government in the ensuing vacuum. For a few fleeting hours, it seemed possible that the weight of the regime might crack. Telephones rang unanswered in ministries, commands conflicted, and officers long disillusioned with Nazi leadership hesitated, torn between action and fear. Inside the ruined hut, chaos settled slowly. The blast had destroyed the table, shattered windows, and killed several officers standing closest to the device. Yet, Hitler emerged from the wreckage alive, his trousers shredded, eardrums damaged, and arm burned, but alive. Photographs taken within hours show him with dust on his uniform and a distant look in his eyes, as though trying to reconcile survival with the force that had nearly claimed him. His anger hardened instantly into retribution. By the time Stauffenberg landed in Berlin, confusion had already seeped into the conspirators' fragile plan. Reports trickled in from East Prussia, conflicting at first, then chillingly clear. Hitler lived. The machinery of the Reich, dormant for only minutes, surged back into motion. Orders were countermanded. Loyalists arrested the hesitant. The window of opportunity closed as swiftly as it had opened. In the Bendler block, as twilight settled over Berlin, the final act of the plot unfolded in a grim, echoing courtyard. The men who had dared to topple the regime faced the consequence they long understood might come. One conspirator whispered before the shots rang out, "We tried to give Germany back its honor." The line survives in a single scrap of testimony, a fragile thread connecting the living to the shadow war that ended in darkness. Yet in that darkness, the myth of Hitler's invincibility suffered its first true wound. The explosion at the Wolf's Lair revealed what propaganda had hidden for years. He had not survived because of destiny. He had survived because fate, chance, and a table leg conspired to spare him by inches. When the July sun rose over Berlin the morning after the Wolf's Lair explosion, the city seemed unchanged on the surface. Trams shuddered along their tracks, factory whistles pierced the dawn, and civilians queued patiently for rations. Yet something in the air felt altered, tense, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Word of the assassination attempt spread slowly, filtered through a fog of propaganda and rumor. To some, it sounded impossible. To others, it felt like the inevitable consequence of a war that had become a burden too heavy for any nation to bear. But deep within the ministries, barracks, and Gestapo offices, the truth was unmistakable. The Reich had come dangerously close to losing its leader. The myth built over a decade, that Hitler moved under the protection of destiny, had cracked in a way even Goebbels' rhetoric could not fully mend. The reprisals began within hours. The Gestapo, long notorious for its efficiency, swept through the homes and offices of anyone even remotely connected to the resistance. Files were opened, interrogations began, and the vast machinery of the police state whirred back to life with grim precision. In courtyards across Berlin, including the Bendler block, the men who had carried the hopes of the conspirators faced their final reckoning. Some met their fate with stoic calm. Others looked toward the sky as though searching for answers in the fading light. The shots that echoed in those enclosed spaces marked not only the end of their lives, but the closure of Germany's most determined internal revolt against the regime. Yet, history has a way of softening the rigid lines drawn in the heat of conflict. With the fall of the Reich 10 months later, Allied investigators uncovered a trove of documents abandoned in the wreckage of Berlin. Among them were files detailing earlier plots long buried by Nazi secrecy, bombs disguised as gifts, rifles positioned on forest ridges, men who had stepped willingly into danger for a cause that offered no reward but the faint hope of a different future. As these fragments were pieced together, a fuller picture emerged. The July plot had not been a solitary act of desperation, but the culmination of a struggle waged quietly for years by soldiers, strategists, and ordinary citizens who saw catastrophe gathering on the horizon long before it reached their gates. In the decades that followed, historians revisited these events with new scrutiny, tracing the lines of courage that existed beneath the overwhelming currents of war. Veterans who had served on the front lines looked back on the summer of 1944 with a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that the war eventually ended, regret that the chance to shorten it by months or even years had slipped away. Letters preserved in attics and archives carried a similar tone. One former officer wrote, "We prayed for a change, for anything that might stop the dying. When we heard that he lived, it felt as though the war had begun again." His sentiment echoed across thousands of miles and dozens of battlefields, a quiet testament to the human cost of those failures. The 40-odd attempts on Hitler's life did not shift the course of the war in any immediate sense. The Allied armies continued their advance from Normandy, the Soviets pressed toward Warsaw and eventually Berlin, and the German people bore the consequences of a conflict prolonged by fear, indecision, and the iron grip of a leader unwilling to yield. Yet the legacy of these attempts rests not in their strategic impact, but in their moral dimension. They reveal a Germany that was not monolithic in its loyalty, a Germany where conscience survived in pockets of resistance despite overwhelming danger. These men and women, bound by principle rather than ambition, stepped into the shadows knowing that success was improbable and survival unlikely. As the years drifted on and Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins, the story of the conspirators took on a quieter, more reflective tone. Memorials were erected, diaries published, testimonies recorded. Their actions, once dismissed as treachery, came to be seen as a final attempt to reclaim a measure of dignity from the wreckage of dictatorship. Historians often note that the July plot failed because of a table leg, a chance gesture by a harried officer, or the unpredictable instincts of a man who trusted no one. But in the broader sweep of history, the plotters' legacy endures not because of what they failed to accomplish, but because of what they chose to risk. In the end, the 40 shadows cast across Hitler's path remind us that even in the darkest moments of the 20th century, there were those who looked beyond obedience and imagined a different Germany, one anchored in law, humanity, and honor. Their efforts did not stop the war, nor could they undo the devastation that followed, but their courage carried forward, echoing through the decades as a reminder that resistance, however fragile, can survive even in the most suffocating environments. The war would eventually end in fire and surrender. The world would move forward, nations rebuilt, and generations born without memories of the fear that once gripped a continent. But in archives, museums, and the quiet corners of military history, the story of the men who tried to strike the match that might have changed everything remains, a testament to the belief that even a single act of conscience can, in time, illuminate the truth. And so, as the final frames of this documentary fade, grainy footage of the Wolf's Lair, the solemn stillness of East Prussian forests, the empty rooms of the Bendler block, we are left with the quiet realization that history is shaped not only by those who rule, but also by those who dare to resist. Their shadows, though often overlooked, stretch far across the years, reminding us of the courage required to stand against the tide of destiny, even when the world seems determined to look away.